Hey guys, welcome to period 8, 1945 to 1958. And this is when the United States becomes a true superpower. This obviously 1945 is the end of World War II. More importantly, for our purposes, and really important to just kind of remember in the background, guys, this is the beginning of the nuclear age. For the first time in history, mankind has weapons that can destroy the planet. And this sets the standard for the Cold War. All right. So that is our first story, which is communism versus capitalism. This is hard on the heels of World War II. The two largest powers that helped defeat the Nazis were the Soviet Union and the United States. But they had two systems that clashed. Go back to the first Red Scare after World War One, and you can remember how the United States has always felt about communism. They see it as a threat to their way of life. Communists see capitalists as a threat to their life, and this creates a standoff. Now, the reason this is a Cold War is for the aforesaid nuclear weapons, because if these two powers ever come into conflict, the entire world is in danger. So what happens instead is you get a bunch of proxy wars within the Cold War. So not long after the end of the Cold War, you get the Korean War and the Vietnam War the following decade. These are part of an incredibly important foreign policy concept that you need to know, and this is containment. All right. Once it was realized that communism was here to stay and that the Soviet Union was a very powerful country, the United States policy over the next 5 decades through 8 presidents was to basically draw a line around communism and to contain it. Some of the policies that you see that we use with that were the Truman Doctrine, which was regards to communism in Europe, the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe so they didn't make the same mistakes they made after World War One. It was adjusted to things like massive retaliation once there were enough nuclear weapons. We basically threatened nuclear annihilation if we were attacked. The Eisenhower Doctrine, which referred to the Middle East, and then into the 1960s with flexible response, in which we used special forces to kind of focus on hotspots around the world. Another thing that's really important in this is outside the time period is Afghanistan. That's the other proxy war, but this is the one that the Soviet Union was involved in, and which is ultimately going to lead to the Soviet Union's demise and the end of the Cold War. In the Vietnam War, one really important event that you need to know is the Tet Offensive. Make sure that you understand the impact that they had, because this changes the way the American public looks at the presidency. And the Tet Offensive and the prosecution of the Vietnam War, combined with Watergate into the 1970s, is going to fundamentally change the trust that Americans have in their government. And this is still an issue that we still have in the United States today. And then finally, a couple of major organizations that you should know is NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The two military alliances that were created and existed from 1947 in NATO's case, 1953 in the Warsaw Pact's case, until the end of the Cold War. And then finally, the 1970s were an era of a cooling down of the Cold War. This was known as détente. We actually visit China and begin to open relationships with China. This causes the Soviet Union to want to dial down the rhetoric, and this leads to the first strategic arms talk, which was SALT I in the 1970s. Story number two, while you have this big picture of the Cold War going on internationally, in the United States, you've got a major rights movement, the largest rights movement in American history, and it ultimately goes to include all groups. Coming out of World War II, it mainly focused on African Americans. A lot of African Americans fought in World War II. They came back. They were not always able to participate in the GI Bill like the white Americans were. The armed forces were finally desegregated after the war. And you finally get the court case Brown versus the Board of Education. So even though you've got like the movement starting in the late 1940s, Brown versus the Board of Education is the catalyst for the civil rights movement. As you see, I've got the civil rights movement broken down between the 50s and the 60s. So you've got kind of the Martin Luther King Jr. decade of the 1950s, passive resistance. You get some of the big events there. And then you go into the 1960s and you see the really important events of the 1960s, and the civil rights movement becomes more, I don't want to say violent, but becomes more, we're not going to stand back and take the abuse anymore. All right. Two of the huge keys to this, guys, are the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These are key events in this time period. Now, as these rights movements get moving, just like way back in the Second Great Awakening, other groups get involved. Women are behind this. The key woman that you absolutely have to know is Betty Friedan and the Feminine Mystique. She basically starts the woman movement with her book, and this eventually turns into the National Organization for Women, leading to Title IX in the 1970s to give young women access to high school sports and college sports. This came to a head with the Equal Rights Amendment, which failed by 3 states to become part of the Constitution, and is still an active amendment to the Constitution, but has not had any movement in years. You also have other groups, the American Indian Movement, Cesar Chavez, and the Hispanic movement, and you get the Stonewall riots and the gay rights movement. These are all important events. Understanding like that this is a civil rights event, but also understanding they could ask questions on civil rights in general or in African American rights. They also like to compare Martin Luther King and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X to Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. So that's a comparison that you can look for. And then finally, you guys should be fairly familiar with this because you guys wrote the DBQ on it and you guys did a great job. But the post-war prosperity. And again, all of this is going on at the same time. You have the Cold War happening internationally. You've got the civil rights movement happening. And at the same time, you've got this massive suburban migration and Sunbelt migration that's going on also. And this goes with the civil rights movement, as you guys saw in the DBQ. It's Levittowns are open only to white people. And so blacks are not allowed to move to these Levittowns. And again, even though they can mandate that they allow blacks to move in, they don't have to accept their money and allow them to buy a house. There's all sorts of real estate laws that are put into place to try to prevent Black Americans from moving into these Levittowns. So this becomes very much of a white movement to suburbia. The baby boom was one of the results of this. And then we tie the nation together with the Federal Highway Act, which is critical. And then the one thing that we didn't get on that DBQ, and make sure you guys know this because this is incredibly important, was the Great Society. Okay, this is often overlooked. This is the next stage of the New Deal. This is a massive movement, and in some ways it accomplishes a lot more than the New Deal did. Outside of Social Security, it's the Great Society that gives us Medicare, Medicaid, the Immigration Reform Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the War on Poverty. And this was the culmination of really over 70 years between the progressive movement, the New Deal, and the Great Society of fundamental change in the role of government in the United States. And we're obviously going to see a reaction to that after 1980. And part of that is also what happens in the 1970s, the post-war boom that went through the 1950s and 60s, in which the United States was a dominant economic power, controlling over 50% of the production in the world. In the 1970s, that changes. And you've got the oil embargo. You've got a horrible period of time known as stagflation, where you had a stagnant economy and high inflation. And this leads to Nixon to create a new concept, which we are still dealing with today, called New Federalism. And this brings back the debate of states' rights versus the federal government. And that debate, which had been settled way back by the Civil War in the 1860s, is now back in the 1970s. And this is a continuing debate today of whether or not states have the right to overrule the federal government, or whether or not states can spend federal money on things that they want to, as opposed to the federal government telling them what they need to spend the money on. Okay, so these are 3 really important stories. You will definitely have an essay question from this time period and possibly a short answer. So this is a great time period to know, guys. All right, thanks. I hope this helped.